And I noticed a number of my fellow trustees here. So
Chair of the board.
Oh, yeah. Not till June 1st. And my pleasure that we can host you. I would like to introduce Dean Maurer. Dean Maurer is the Dean of the School of Social Sciences and Professor of Anthropology and Law at UC Irvine. Bill has been reappointed for another 5-year term, so congratulations.
Yeah, Bill.
The term builds upon his past decade of service, owning the campus's largest academic unit in terms of student enrollment, which graduates 25% of the campus's bachelor degree recipients each year. And way back in 1974, I'm a proud graduate of the School of Social Sciences. I think we have that same statistic with the largest representation on campus. Bill is an anthropologist. He has decades of experience in coordinating collaborative and community-based social science research, including most recently a community-driven study of financial vulnerability in Orange County. He's an expert in new forms of currency, and this year completed a report with researchers at MIT in Indonesia, India, Nigeria, and Mexico on the promise and pitfalls of digital currency to inform U.S. and global policy on central bank issued digital currencies. Bill promised that he's going to take care of the current debt crisis. Bill just recently returned from Europe. He was the keynote speaker at a conference in Malta for central banks and the banknote industry, the people who make the cash. And hopefully we brought some to share right now. And he can show you a next generation banknote if you are interested. In addition, Bill serves on the University of California's System-Wide Artificial Intelligence Council, advising the Office of the President on the use and risks of AI-enabled technology. So be careful. Closer to home, Bill's a member of the board of our Orange County United Way, where he works on projects to address financial insecurity. So let us have Bill come up.
Is this mic, right? Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, Gary. Thanks for hosting us. And thank you all for being here with us at Big Canyon Club. It's really an honor and a delight to host this next economic forum. The economic forum that we've been hosting through the School of Social Sciences really was the brainchild of our alum, Peter Trepp, whom I'll introduce in a moment here. Started during the pandemic, and here we all are in person, but I do want to acknowledge the 100 or so people who were joining us via the Zoom webinar. So welcome to you online as well. This is an opportunity, obviously, to reflect on important and pressing economic issues like the cliff that was just referenced, which maybe will do things to the bond market, whether or not something actually happens next week. But other issues more broadly. So we welcome the opportunity to share the expertise of our faculty, of our alums, and our supporters as we reflect on the current state of the economy, both at home and abroad. There will also obviously be more time for networking and socializing after our panel presentation. We have 4 esteemed guests who will be moderated by Peter, and then I'll help handle the Q&A after their presentation. So without any further ado, let me introduce folks who are unhelpfully not arranged in the order with which they're on my paper. But Nina Bandelj is a Chancellor's Professor of Sociology at UC Irvine and the Associate Vice Provost for Faculty Development. She's also the co-director of the Center for Organizational Research at UCI. She studies the social bases of economic processes, dispelling the assumption that the economy runs solely on supply and demand. Her most recent book is called Money Talks, and it dives deeply into the topic of money, which academically, but also professionally, is near and dear to my own heart. How we make sense of money, what it is in the age of Bitcoin and Apple Pay, and how the social meanings and uses of really infuse all aspects of it, even if we mostly narrowly focus on its economic dimensions. She got her international baccalaureate in Ljubljana in Slovenia, her bachelor's at Augsburg College in Minneapolis, and her master's and PhD in sociology at Princeton. Maybe we'll just stick with the Princeton people. So Brian Leach is Executive Vice President, Credit Strategist, and Head of PIMCO's America's Credit Product Strategy Team in Newport. Prior to joining PIMCO in 2013, he worked at Northern Lights Capital, a private equity firm focused on the money management industry. He worked also at BlackRock, where he evaluated and managed portfolios of private investment funds, and has 13 years of investment experience. His MBA in analytic finance and in economics is from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and his undergraduate degree is from Princeton. So maybe we go from Chicago and Princeton to MIT. Jack, there he is. Jack Liebersohn is assistant professor of economics at UCI, who specializes in household finance, corporate finance, and housing markets. His most recent work looks at how housing booms and busts happen, finding that the location of growing industries, manufacturing or financial services, plays a large role. He joined the UCI faculty right when the pandemic was starting, right before the pandemic. So this is one of the few occasions I've interacted with him in person instead of in a little Zoom box, which is great. As Nina pointed out, he's taller than we all thought, or maybe it's the pinstripe suit. And before coming here, he was on the faculty at Ohio State. He got his bachelor's in economics and mathematics at Amherst, and then worked at the Board of Governors at the Federal Reserve in DC as an analyst before heading to MIT, where he got his PhD in financial economics from the Sloan School of Management. Roger Nieves, here to my right, is a member of the board of Special Olympics for Southern California and former managing director at PIMCO. For the Special Olympics, he serves as treasurer, member of the executive committee, and chair of the finance committee. And previously, he served as managing director for PIMCO. He earned his MBA at WashU in St. Louis, his master's at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and his bachelor's at UCI. Social sciences, econ. And our other econ alum here from social sciences, Peter Trepp, UCI class of '88, Anderson School MBA class of '98, is a tech entrepreneur and former investment banker with $1 billion in exits during his career. His current venture, well, it's there's another current venture that is venturing forth, but the current venture that I will mention is Validiti, a marketplace for secure consumer data that's working to disrupt the personal data monetization market. He is the author of a book called The New Rules of Consumer Privacy, about how consumer-facing organizations can balance customers' needs for privacy, security, and convenience. And he's recognized as a thought leader in tech and a frequent media contributor. Prior to founding Validiti, he served as the CEO of Faced First, a recognized leader in the global financial recognition market. And I remember when I was first coming to know Peter, I was traveling from somewhere to somewhere else internationally. Do you remember this? And it was still it wasn't early days of those facial recognition things at the airport, but early enough that I'm like, oh, this is great. I can just walk on through now. There's the facial recognition thing. But it said, take off your glasses, okay? And then it said, align your face here. Now, when I take off my glasses, I cannot align my face anywhere. So I emailed to complain, and he didn't really respond, but that was like our little initial getting to know you. He got his bachelor's, as I said, at UC Irvine, his MBA at the UCLA Anderson School. He previously served as the president of the UCLA Anderson Alumni Association and is currently the chairman of the board of counselors for the School of Social Sciences here at his alma mater, UC Irvine. Peter's going to invite the panelists in turn to speak. They're going to say a few words. Then he will moderate a discussion among them, and then we'll have some Q&A. So again, thank you all so much for coming. Again, thank you to those of you who are online, and I will hand it over to you, Peter, okay? Thanks. I have to go this way.
That button. this economic forum last year, we were, as you interested, were going up, and there were a lot of questions about whether or not we were in a recession or going into a recession. One was give you the back. We're hanging on bonds. Okay, there we go. Got it. So I turn on CNBC in the morning, maybe some of you do, and I see a lot of equities flying across the screen and what the Dow's doing, but I don't see a bond sometimes. There's definitely some of it there. It's a huge part of our capital markets, and I thought it would be warranted to have a conversation about this and get some people from academia and people from industry to talk about this. And I think, a lot of people don't necessarily know what a bond is or whether a bond should be in your portfolio or things like that. So we're gonna cover that. And Jack, if you want to start us off here, let's just maybe have kind of a refresher or kind of on what bonds are and how to think about what a bond is. Horace?
Sounds good. Sounds like this. It's not working either. All right, let's go for the mic. Do I click or will it be clicked for me? Ah.
I can click it for you.
Let's see. Oh yes. And I also see it right there. Back. Okay. So this discussion is called "What's a Bond Anyways?" So I thought I would start by asking, "What's a bond anyways?" Some of you in the audience know a lot more about what a bond is than I do, especially if you work for PIMCO. But just to get everybody on the same page, sort of set a common foundation, I'm going to start by talking about a few basic facts about what a bond is. So a bond is a way to borrow. Maybe a firm will issue a bond to borrow, or a government, a municipal government or national government. So in some ways, it's a lot like a loan. But the difference is that a bond is a security, meaning that it's traded, and so its price can fluctuate. But whoever issues the bond, meaning whoever is borrowing, similar to a loan, will get principal to begin with, and then they're going to need to make regular interest payments. And then eventually, they'll pay the principal back. That's the typical way. There are some exceptions, but that's the sort of typical way a bond works. Now, the rights to those cash flows, whoever is getting the cash flows, that can be traded in a market. So a company might issue a bond and might get principal from me and promise to pay me in the future. But let's say I don't want that repayment in the future. I can sell it to somebody else and then they'll get repaid instead. And that's the sense in which it can be traded in a bond market. So similar to a stock or any other type of traded securities, bonds have prices which fluctuate. But if you talk to a bond trader or anyone who's experienced in bond markets, they don't generally talk about bond prices. Instead, what they talk about are bond yields. And yields are a kind of average interest rate over the life of the bond. If there's high demand for the bonds, many people want the bonds issued by that company or by the government or whatever. Then the bond traders are willing to accept low yields for the bond. They really want it, and so they're willing to accept low yields, and so the bond yields will fall. Or another equivalent way of saying that is that the prices will rise. So why would the demand or the supply fluctuate, and what determines the yields? Well, a couple of different things. One is what we call the time value of money. Money today is more valuable than money in the future. And so if I'm going to lend a company money by buying their bond, I'm going to demand an interest rate. In addition to the time value of money, there are various risks. If a company is at risk of default, then they're going to have to pay higher rates on the bond. And because traders are going to have to be compensated for those risks. But the risk of default is not the only relevant risk. There are all sorts of other risks, and an important one is the risk of inflation. If a bond promises a principal payment in the future, but I'm really worried that that principal payment will be inflated away, then I might demand higher interest rates. In other words, I might demand a higher yield to hold the bond. And so inflation risk is another important risk that determines the yield. And all those risks combined with whatever the appetite for risk is, sort of determine yields in the bond market. So I've talked about bonds, they're these traded securities, but when we talk about the bond markets, we generally talk about them in relation to what the Fed is doing. And that's because the Fed plays a really important role in determining rates in the bond market. And the reason is that they set interest rates on very short-term bonds. The interest rate they set is known as the Fed funds rate. I went online. The St. Louis Fed has a website where you can get all sorts of data, including Fed funds rates. And there you can see the Fed funds rate from the last, I guess, 8 years. You can see that since 2022, the Fed funds rate has gone up a lot. Now, these are very short-term and very safe bonds. And the interest rate has gone from about 0 to about 5% on those bonds. Now, if you're a bond trader or just an ordinary person like myself, and you can get 5% on short-term safe bonds, then you're probably going to insist on getting a similar yield on any other bond in the market. And what that means is that when the Fed increases rates, all the other bond yields are going to follow. Higher rates reduce the demand for any bonds that would pay a lower yield. And the sort of supply and demand in the market are going to increase rates on all the other bonds, and in fact, all the other loans and all the other forms of borrowing that are out there available to firms and available to individual people. So if we look at these other lines that I've added to the graph, they show the interest rates on 2 other types of debt. The blue line shows the average 30-year fixed rate mortgage. And the green line shows the yield on AAA corporate bonds. So these are like very safe, longer-term corporate bonds. And what you can see is that when the Fed raised the Fed funds rate, the bond market increased the yield on those other forms of debt, which increased the cost of borrowing for firms in the green line, and for individual people in the blue line. If I want to go get a mortgage now, I have to pay a higher rate. And the reason for that has to do with the bond market, that when the Fed increases rates, the yields on the other types of debt go up as well. Now, what is the effect of all of this? Well, the effect of all of this is that when interest rates rise, it changes a lot of things about the economy. It becomes more expensive for companies to borrow and invest. It also affects companies' appetite to take risks. It increases the cost of borrowing for individuals through the mortgage market, through the credit card market, through the individual loan market. And it changes whether people want to save their money or spend it. Because if people's investments also return a higher amount, then they'd rather save it and not borrow on their credit card. And all these different changes will affect all sorts of economic variables, the unemployment rate, the state of the housing market. And we'll talk about some of those things more today, perhaps. So that's the end of my formal slideshow, but as a special treat, I want to show you something provided by Dean Marr, which is a bond certificate from, what year is this? 1927. And this is apparently a 50-year bond. I'll give you this. Because nowadays bonds are all electronic, I think, for the most part. But at this time, they came with these paper certificates. What you can see here is these little pieces of paper that are attached to the end of the bond certificate. These pieces are known as coupons. And when the company made their regular, what amount to interest payments, you'd rip off a coupon and use it to redeem the interest payment from the firm. The certificate itself, I don't know, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what you would have to use to get the principal repaid in apparently 1977. So this was a 50-year bond. It looks like nobody used it to get their principal payment back. And the coupons also, weren't removed. Somebody missed out. Should look into that. Right. Should look into that. This is really cool. You could. There are bonds without interest payments that are called strips, and the reason they have that name is that you could physically strip off the coupons here and then trade the bond note itself. And you could also just trade the coupons, which have their own value. And it still works in exactly the same way, except nowadays it's all electronic and not nearly as fun. All right, thank you.
Your microphone's working, Brian, or?
In the back, I was just going to use that one.
Yeah, go right ahead.
I'll let Brian take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. And unlike you, Jack, I have the opposite problem is after I meet people on Zoom and then in person, I'm never taller than them. So it's not an issue for me, but nonetheless, share an interest like you do in fixed income and bonds in general. And first of all, I'd like to thank everybody, really excited to be here today and look forward to a lively Q&A discussion and the subsequent happy hour where Roger and I were joking we can then have some wine probably post this discussion. But maybe just offering a little bit of a practitioner's point of view, I wanted to cover a couple of different topics today. The first one is how do you formulate an approach to the bond markets, to fixed income, to creating an investment process as it relates to fixed income. The second is hopefully give you some sense why I know we're biased, but we think bonds are exciting. You already stole my CNBC point, but I think we fully agree with the point that there's probably a little bit less time spent in market discussion around fixed income, although hopefully that's changing a little bit this year. And then thirdly, offer some perspective on where we're seeing opportunities. We've been harping on this theme of bonds are back, and hopefully some of that will resonate with you as you think about the role in a portfolio, the opportunity set as we see it today. But maybe starting with that long-term lens, how do we go about formulating views in terms of where there might be value within fixed income? Jack articulated the investment opportunity set to some degree, but when we think about an approach and formulating an approach to the bond market, it's really threefold. It's having a near-term view, a cyclical view, and then a secular view. This is a part of the market that if you think of a high-flying tech company, some parts of the fixed income market tend to take more of a longer-term convergence towards valuations. So what we start with is a secular view. So 3 to 5 year type outlook. We bring in outside speakers once a year. We just had our secular forum in May, but the idea really is to distill what are those important factors that will drive the global economy over 3-5 years out. Obviously, talk of geopolitical conflict in Taiwan and China over this last session, artificial intelligence, longer term topics that might drive value in some of these trends we're trying to capitalize on. The second part of that process is developing a 6 to 12 month outlook, which we can spend some time on today, but that's a little bit more implementable. Where do we think the economy's heading? What are some of the key drivers on the interest rate side, on the corporate side? What do profits look like across companies that we cover? And then lastly, more of that tactical lens. We're meeting daily, we're having discussions. Debt ceiling is obviously in vogue right now. And so coming out of that, our view of the economy for the next 6 to 12 months is, given everything that's happened the last quarter in terms of some of the banking market volatility, we think we're likely heading for a recession sooner than we were anticipating, and perhaps a little bit more challenging, slightly deeper, although still a mild recession is our base case. We think central banks are continuing to shift from being broadly restrictive. We might see some pivots or at least a pause in the case of central banks globally. So what was a pretty distinct headwind might potentially turn into a tailwind probably sometime next year. And then generally, you've had this really strong tailwind from fiscal policy, from monetary policy. We're going to go through a couple of tricky years here where you might get headwinds or you might move in fits and starts. We're seeing that out of Washington, D.C. and some of the headlines these last few weeks. So starting from that lens, well, how do we think about bonds? And we often have to retort to the question, well, bonds are boring, I'll focus my time on stocks. And I think it's somewhat CNBC driven, pick your financial entity. But one of the facts that I like to lead with is, not only is the bond market exceptionally large, it's larger than the stock market. So if you look at the global bond market, it's about $127 trillion. Stock market's about 124, although that was the end of last year. So maybe that's moved a little bit, but generally it's an asset class that's underfollowed, which is why we tend to like it. It's also much, much more complex. If you think of the stock market broadly, you're usually looking at one, maybe a couple of different ways to access a company's stock, at least in the public markets. But as you think about bonds, you're looking at potentially dozens or more of bonds associated with one given entity, various tenors, even on the government side. But then when you extend that to the corporate markets, which is my purview, you're looking at different tenors, different currencies, different maturities, different structures, some high quality, some low quality. So the complexity, we believe, makes the market, I know I'm biased, much more interesting. And then I think the last component of why the market on the bond fixed income side is so different is the buyer base is incredibly dispersed. So as we think about that 127 trillion or so of overall fixed income, about half of that is purchased by what we call non-economic buyers. So those that are purchasing securities for a reason that's not, how do I maximize yield, how do I maximize return, but some other optimization that they're going through. So from our perspective, that complexity, that dispersed buyer base really introduces a lot of interesting opportunities. It takes resources to cover. It's a different market. I know we're biased, but we get up every day very excited about the market. So part of my job is getting people excited about the market. And that really relates to the third piece, which is, well, what do things look like today? You showed that chart, which was the Fed funds was at zero, and obviously it's moved substantially higher. I would think about that as a pretty reasonable proxy for the number of phone calls I get. So when bonds are at zero, when there's not a lot of spread or yield in the market, my phone rings a little bit less. Maybe I'm making more calls. I'm talking to our sales teams, trying to get people out there, getting interested in the asset class. My phone's picked up a lot this year. And part of the reason for that is not only are cash rates higher, you're looking at opportunities that we haven't seen in years, in some cases decades. So to give you some sense for that, today, cash is roughly at 5%. You're probably seeing that in CDs, other high quality liquid instruments. From our purview, we're now looking at high single digit, low double digit type yields across a lot of that corporate credit opportunity set. So more interesting opportunities, not to say that that comes with little or no risk, but I think more interesting things that we're seeing and doing. And that really relates to, I think, one of the final points that's very different about stocks and bonds is, if you look at high quality bonds generally, 90% plus of their returns are going to be driven by those coupons. So as you think about the yields that Jack was talking about, that's a really good ballast for what your returns are likely to be. Very different than what you'd see on the stock side. So from our perspective, obviously the pendulum swings a bit with what central banks are doing, but This is a time when phone calls have been picking up. There's more interesting things to talk about, even if it's not on CNBC to the same degree we see on the stock side. So hopefully that's helpful just in terms of some questions, but thanks again for the opportunity to speak with you.
All right, well, thanks, Brian, and good evening, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here on this panel, humbled to be here with these fantastic presenters. My name is Roger Nieves. I did spend 21 years at PIMCO, but in the last year, my role and responsibilities have evolved. I've become more involved with some nonprofits, my local town. I'm on their investment advisory committee. And so I feel like I've had a little, I'm seeing many of the same issues that Brian mentioned, but from a slightly different lens this year, sort of being across the table as sort of representing some institutions that are deploying money. And it's interesting to see the challenges that they are facing, right? The opportunities actually with 5% yields, but also some of the challenges. And I'll give you, and also some individual investors I talked to. And I'll give you one anecdote from my own mother, actually, who has a set of 9-month risk-free CDs from one of the 2 or 3 largest banks in this country. And I won't mention which one to not hurt anybody's feelings. But what do you think the yield is on those 9-month CDs? Maybe somebody in the audience. 0.4? 0.01% yield on those 9-month CDs. So to just do the math, and it's not, and actually, why does she have all these different CDs? She's got different CDs and the names of different kids and grandkids. But let's just say it's not $1 million, but let's just say it's $1 million, right? She could be earning $50,000 a year from those CDs, given that rates have moved up, as Brian and Jack described, and that's 50,000 taxable, but she's not in a very high tax bracket, so let's call it, not too taxable. Which pays for real things, right? It pays for rent and it pays for insurance and groceries, versus, earning $100 on that $1 million, which is just outrageous. And I mention it because, and I know many of you are trustees on different roles and different committees. I've seen some of the challenges that they face trying to capitalize on this 5%, right? I know a gentleman who's involved in some public investment, and so he's been buying CDs that yield a lot more than the 0.01, closer to 4 or 5%. But he's also struggling with the Silicon Valley Bank risk of having over $500,000 in a CD, and we can maybe talk a little bit about that. Another gentleman told me about, and we were talking about when the 2-year yields at 5%, and we were talking, gosh, hey, it's this 2-year government guaranteed investment yielding 5%. Load up the truck on that, open a Treasury direct account. So yeah, I don't really have a Treasury direct account. It's so, to Brian's point, the bond market is global and there's so much scale, but accessing it sometimes is a little trickier for folks, right? And you can do it with bond funds, and there's active and passive bond funds, and you can do it with CDs if you have cash-like savings. But the other thing that and Jack mentioned some of the interest rate risk. The other question that's come up in some of these committee discussions is, well, okay, so should I buy a 2-year or a 5-year or a 10-year? And then you start to, inject the question about, well, when do you need your money back? Because if you need your money back in 2 years and you bought a 10-year bond, right, then you run some risk that the market can move against you as it did last year. And I was telling Brian before the event today, I thought I was some sort of pro after 21 years at PIMCO investing in the bond market. And I got pretty burned last year with some of my, fixed income investments when rates moved up. So there's a lot of challenges, and I won't list them all because it'll take the whole hour. Cybersecurity, inflation. I'll give you another anecdote. I joined this gym. You can't tell, I'm working on it, but year over year, what do you think the rate increase is at my gym? It's like 30% year over year increase in the dues for it's a nice gym, but 30%, come on guys. But the reason I mentioned that gets to Jack's point about inflation, right? I'm thrilled to be earning 5%, but if the sole reason I had invested that money to yield 5% was to pay for my gym membership, I'm falling behind. I should, so that's another important risk that we need to think about. And happy to chat more in Q&A about this, but I just wanted to share a little bit about that perspective. And also I wanted to mention, Jack, when you rolled out that certificate, so I'm sadly old enough to have my student loan book from Sallie Mae. I don't know if anybody else had those. Actually, my UCI loans, which were like 8% coupon, 8% interest rate, had that little coupon little book, and I had to mail it in. And I had very modest income, struggling to pay that 8%. It's like, struggling just to keep up with interest. But I thought that's what you were sharing earlier. Anyway, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger. Do we have to use this microphone? I'm not going to sing karaoke still. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Oh, I will try to multitask. I'm a professor. It's really great to be here. And I've learned so much already from my esteemed colleagues on this panel, who are all economists. And I am not one. I'm a sociology professor. So you may wonder, what do I have to say to contribute to this panel? But before I say a few words, I would like to ask you to do something for me. I know we already acknowledged our dear Dean, Bill Maurer. He is going to be our leader for 5 more years, but I can tell you on behalf of social sciences, we have to do it one more time. He is terrific, extraordinary, and he's willing to do this. And he's done it during the pandemic, the hardest of times, as we all know. So thank you so much, and we look forward. And that also got us in good spirits. So it's a good note to start with, and that's when my time starts. So I wanted to make clear right away what I would like you to remember from my remarks today. I would like to convince you that in order to understand financial bonds, we need to understand social bonds. Financial decisions have a lot to do with people, with relationships, with social relations. So let me show you that I'm right. So I want to ask you to tell me if you came here, how you came here and why you came here. If you have a social bond to social sciences, you're an alum, you're on the Dean's Leadership Society, you are on the Board of Counselors, you are a trustee of UCI, and yes, I'm a professor, so I do want to see a show of hands. So if you've come here because you have a connection to UCI through these ties, we're seeing a lot of hands up, right? Exactly. Now I'm going to ask, some of you came because you have a social bond to somebody who was invited. So you could have spent your Tuesday afternoon not listening to such a fascinating topic as financial bonds, but you still came because you have a strong bond to your spouse or partner, to your good friend, maybe a parent or a child. So how many came because you have a bond to somebody who's here and was invited? And you know, you could even show that bond by raising both hands up, because I'm sure it's a very strong one. Now, also, the decisions you might make related to financial bonds will have to do with such relationships, right? Through your connections with financial advisors, who are very important, by talking to other people in your social network, by watching what others do in your circles and following the crowds, and to invest perhaps in order to create or affirm a social bond. I heard, Roger, your mom has some bonds for her kids and grandkids. So this is why I love money. I love money because it tells us what we hold near and dear. It tells us about the relationship we want to forge and perhaps break off. It also is full of emotions. It's true that oftentimes we think that money operates in this objective, cold sphere of supply and demand. But what I'm interested in as an economic sociologist is the social meaning of money. This, in fact, is a cover of a very famous book that Professor Viviana Zelizer of Princeton University wrote many years back, and I had the pleasure to study with Professor Zelizer at Princeton. Later on, we, in fact, wrote and compiled together another book on money, and here, back to Bill Maurer, our dean, he actually has a chapter in this book. He knows a lot about money. As you saw, he also has real physical examples of money. Those bonds were really fascinating. So we really are interested in these social relationships and how money talks. I have only a couple of minutes, so I've said all these things, but the real confession is that I have not been studying or researching financial bonds directly. What I've been working on recently is related to the parenting economy. It's all the money that we save, we spend, we invest, and we take on debt for the sake of children. So I wanted to give you just a quick example here about a transformation over time. Oh, by the way, it's a lot of money, as this picture reveals. The financial assets under children's names or for children, we think it's so natural that we would do everything for our kids, but this has been a relatively recent phenomenon. So we talk about checking accounts, savings accounts, money market accounts under children's names or for children. And they have grown, as you see on this chart, quite remarkably over time in the past 20 years or so, since 1988, that the trend here shows. What's also important is that as a share of assets that a household holds, what we devote for children has grown spectacularly too. So that, to a sociologist, signals what is important. What do we prioritize in our lives? And it has been children. Now, equally historically, we need to think about bonds, right? Something we think is natural, just happens now, is happening in a historical context. So here is a figure that shows how little, in fact, only 1% of household wealth, that is families' wealth, is in bonds, right? Much more in all these other things, retirement accounts, equity in the home, and stocks and mutual funds. To understand that, we have to think historically how it came to be that we started to think of the market as the stock market, how we came to love risk-taking, how we came to listen to financial advisors, and how that has professionalized. And I have some esteemed colleagues with that experience right here. So in that way, what we know about bonds is important to be put in this social context. Not to mention that it also goes back to social bonds, and that I looked up how the US Treasury offers, have my notes here, advertises giving savings bonds as gifts for the new baby, graduation, grandchild's birthday. So, to wrap up, this is not coincidence. Our title here, What's a Bond and Why Do We Care? What I tried to say is that what we care about greatly impacts what we do with money. So thank you for the opportunity to share just a little bit about that social and emotional meaning of money. So thank you, and with affection, I'm turning this back to Peter.
Thank you, Nina. That was terrific. I love that slide. That's great. Thank you all for your comments. I appreciate it. It's super. You know, when we thought about putting this forum together today, I thought it would be great to get these different perspectives. They're all wonderful. I really appreciate it. I want to expand a little bit on each of your comments and just kind of keep the conversation going for a moment. And so, you know, when we think about bonds out in the capital markets, and it's amazing to think about how big the bond market is and how many assets are out there. I think most people don't, as you guys pointed out, most people don't really understand the marketplace. It's remarkable. And if a company or a government wants to raise money, you know, in a company, we think about, well, they can sell stock. They can do an IPO or market. And as an investor, I can companies, I can buy stock and I can kind of trade in that. But companies can also issue bonds as another way to raise capital. Governments can raise money and issue bonds as well. Jack, maybe if I could ask you first, could you expand a little bit maybe on that thinking, like why would somebody issue, why would an entity issue bonds rather than stock? Is there an advantage to issuing bonds over stock, and what are those advantages? What might that look like?
So let's say that take a company that we all know, I don't know, Amazon or something, wants to raise money. And we hear that Jeff Bezos is going to sell a bunch of his shares of Amazon. I guess he personally wants to raise money in our scenario. He's going to sell a bunch of his shares. If I heard that in the news, I would take a step back and I'd say, that's probably a bad sign. He probably knows something that we don't know about this company. And I don't really want to own those shares if that's what's going on. As that example illustrates, when companies sell shares, and it's not an IPO, it's just a company that already exists, investors might take that as a bad sign, that there's something that the management knows about the company that the general public doesn't know. And for that reason, companies don't like to sell their shares because investors will take that as a bad sign. Stocks are what, you know, academics like to use fancy words for things. And so we say that stocks are informationally sensitive, right? When a company sells shares, that provides information to the market and shareholders infer something from it. Bonds are much less informationally sensitive. When a company sells bonds, as long as they're not close to bankruptcy, there's a pretty good chance those bonds will be repaid. And so companies are able to sell bonds to the market to raise funds without it being a bad signal about the future of the company. And for that reason, companies that already exist, so not talking about an IPO, but an existing company, will generally prefer to issue a bond as compared to issuing shares. And so that's generally the preferred ways that companies will raise money for new investments.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Perfect. Oh yeah, no, I'm going to keep the conversation going here, and I'm going to add on to that as well. So Brian, maybe you could help us here. So as we heard earlier, bonds have risks associated with them. Some bonds are a little riskier than other bonds, and there are rating agencies that rate bonds, so we can understand kind of the risk profile of those bonds. I remember some number of years ago. I'm older than you, I'm pretty sure. We used to call bonds junk bonds if they were, right? What do we call them? High yield bonds today, right? So it got a fancier name. Do we like those risky bonds? Are those good bonds? Do we trade in those bonds, and why? What's going on there?
Yeah, I always joke that if somebody's looking for a new job, high yield bonds need a brand manager. They have this nomenclature of junk bonds, but in reality, the asset class has changed tremendously since the 80s in terms of usage. But I think it's important to level set in terms of the informationally sensitive nature of stocks, as you highlighted. And I think we would largely agree that there's many really promising reasons that companies take out debt. It can be for a new building. It can be very simple in terms of we're raising money for a new project. But I think there's a more pernicious potential source of why you might want to raise money. And to look at the high yield bond market specifically, we'd probably circle the high yield market, the bank loan market, and what's now the private debt markets as a part of the market that's really taken advantage of some of this low interest rate environment of the last 5 to 10 years. So if we think about what this debt's generally used for, it's typically used for either companies that are lower in quality, so they have to pay a bit more than an investment grade company to borrow. So to give you some numbers right now, most investment grade companies pay about 1 to 1.5% above the treasury markets, whereas high yield, you're looking more at like 4 to 5%. What's happened in the last few years, and this will get to the punchline, is the higher quality parts of the high yield market are the part that really suffers the branding issue. So if you look at a junk bond that's the highest quality junk bond, it's BB. Historically, that part of the markets paid you back about 99.5% of the time. So a default rate well under 1%. If you look at the lower quality parts of the high yield market, they pay you back about 94% of the time. So default about 6% of the time. We actually think that part of the market is in pretty good shape over the next couple of years. But if you think back to the graph, it's sort of intuitive, but which borrowers do you think are going to be most challenged in this junk bond, in this lower quality debt market? It's those that are susceptible to rising interest rates. So you've gone from 0 to 5%. So if you're paying back that debt and you are paying a 5% incremental yield above those government bonds, well, now that's 10%. So by and large, we think corporate fundamentals look pretty good. We think most parts of the corporate credit market are reasonably well supported, including the higher quality parts of the high yield market. But I would say those that have taken out floating rate debt where interest costs are now elevated are the ones that we're most concerned about.
Thank you. Kind of like thinking about a mortgage on your house. Interest rates are going up, your mortgage goes up, gets a little harder to afford those higher mortgages, right? Roger, so stocks can get complicated. We can buy options and calls and puts and all sorts of strategies and so forth. You can get pretty tricky pretty fast, right? Bonds also have some complexity to them. There are CLOs, collateral loan obligations, and all sorts of elements to bonds that we don't generally talk about on CNBC every day, but you hear about them from time to time. If you're a buyer of bonds, if you're a pension fund or an investor into the bond market, how do you think about the kinds of investments you're going to make? How do you weigh those investment decisions? How tricky do you get? And who does that for you? Do we need to hire PIMCO or somebody to do that for me? How does that work?
One easy way to do it. I'll go back to a point Jack made earlier. He talked about some of the major types of bonds out there. In the US, the 3 biggest categories actually are the US government, the folks in Washington. I'm sure we're going to get their act together very soon, so that the US Treasury will continue to be the gold standard globally. It's the biggest market, it's the most liquid market, it's the most attractive market to all sorts of global investors. So the US full faith and credit government is a major issuer. Second major issuer is, as Brian and Jack mentioned, corporations, right? Corporations that borrow to invest, to grow, to meet ongoing operating expenses. And third, we've talked a little bit less about this area, although you mentioned mortgages just a second ago, are sort of all of us as consumers. And one really, really big chunk of that is our home mortgages, right? So every month when we make our monthly payment, if you have a mortgage, to Rocket Mortgage or whoever, right? A certain percentage of that goes to pay the interest on your mortgage debt. A certain amount might go towards principal every month. And that payment of coupon and principal gets sold to investors like PIMCO and others who are representing other entities often sometimes, big insurance companies and others who want access to that cash flow that you're making every month. The reason I make it just kind of review the big three categories is because you asked, like, how do you as an institutional investor think about it? They're all good. It's not like one is better, they're just different, right? And so you think about, what do you want your portfolio to do? Do I want it to generate income, maximum income for a certain reason? Do I want it to diversify my equity exposure? Oftentimes, I'm guessing for most folks in this room, stocks are a larger piece of their personal portfolio than bonds. And bonds have this very nice characteristic that they zig when stocks zag often. Not always, but very often they will. Last year was an unfortunate detour from that long historical pattern where they both got clobbered at the same time. But historically, they have tended to zig when stocks zag, and that makes a very nice diversifier. And so that smoothing benefit is very important to institutional investors. And then I'll come back to a little bit to the point I made earlier, is you, as an institutional investor and trustees and foundation executives and others who are in this room, it's really important to know what is the weighted average life that you want for this investment, right? If you're saving up for a down payment on a house next year, you really shouldn't be taking a lot of interest rate risk, right? Because there's a lot that can move against you. But if you are investing for retirement, right, and you're not going to retire for the next 30 years, then the weighted average life of your portfolio, stocks and bonds, can be kind of long. So that's another big consideration. And it's interesting when you guys were talking about the different parts of the bond market. Really, and maybe this is a semi-transition, is you really the work you mentioned on social bonds is so true in the bond market as well, right? For a long time, one of the big executives at PIMCO had in their office the quote from JP Morgan about how lending is all about character, right? And so even in today's modern bond market, you really need to think about, will they pay me back? Do they want to pay me back? Can they pay me back? There were, investors recently in Credit Suisse, right? Who thought that they had something that was a more bond-like investment than a stock, but ended up doing not quite as well as the stock investors, right? Getting hammered a little bit. And politics, we've made a few jokes about the debt ceiling discussions and all that, but that matters too, right? Do they want to pay you back? And we've seen that over the years if you've invested in emerging market countries, right? Sometimes you need to ask, can they pay me back? Do they want to pay me back? And ideally, both those things align, but sometimes they don't. And that really reminds me of that beautiful language that you're using.
Thank you, Roger. That's terrific. Nina, a question for you. So I can remember when I was very young, a long, long time ago, we had these double E bonds. Then you'd take them to the bank when they matured and you'd cash them in and so forth. that's changed dramatically. And I think the way families, you talk about social bonds and financial bonds, and we've heard the advice that young people get, invest early. The time value of money is very powerful, right? It's too late for me, but if you're a young person and investing and you can invest over time, it's a really powerful thing. How are families evolving and changing and thinking about their relationship with money and maybe even bonds, to some degree? How does that relate as you think about it?
Yeah. Great question. Thank you so much. And before, I just want to award Roger here the honorary certificate in economic sociology, since you linked so well to social bonds. Families have changed substantially. So let me just go back to your point, though, Peter, about young people investing. So just this past week, I was at a dissertation defense of for one of my students, an advisee, who's now Dr. Kim. Yay, very happy. And her dissertation is on young adults and money. What do young adults do with money? And I was very surprised as to how many talked about investing. Because if we look at national statistics, even though we move in such circles, the great majority of Americans don't. And so it was quite surprising to me, and mostly she recruited her respondents through UCI, unknown university, don't tell anyone. And I figured perhaps through their social ties, through the networks, through opportunities that they have. I know that our undergraduate affairs and social sciences brings guests to talk about financial knowledge. And so that is the way that young people learn, but they also learn on the internet. So it was very clear that that was a big deal and that information out there is crucial in how they access it and talk to each other about it. So, it's also, going back to families, was very interesting to me how she found from these young people that they believe parents should do everything for their kids unconditionally. And I figured, well, right? They talked about, well, they had me, so they have to take care of me. I didn't ask to be born. Whoa. And I said, that was probably just one person, right, out of the 50 people she spoke to. No. So, the understanding of the child-parent bond has certainly changed. I use the language of investment, in fact. I say that these days parents are invested in parenting. What does that mean? Of course, about money, but also about emotions, right? We put everything in our children. So no wonder, I guess, that children now understand it to be just so natural and don't ask these questions. So I really, if folks have questions, we can expand upon that, but goes back to these social bonds and the fact that they do change over time.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. Yeah, we're going to transition to some questions from the audience. I think, first of all, if it's posted on social media, it's probably true, right? So just know that. I can tell you as a parent. But yeah, would you like to facilitate some questions? That'd be great. Thank you very much.
Okay, so yeah, questions. I'll just rove around with the mic. Yeah.
The gentleman from PIMCO. So there's a lot of talk that the real volatility is likely after the debt ceiling gets voted on. And can you help the audience understand how the plumbing works? Like the money supply is going to collapse post debt ceiling, and it could actually cause more volatility, perhaps a week or 2 weeks from now in the markets?
Yeah, can you hear me back there? Yeah. So maybe just a couple of comments. I think it sort of gets back to this near term versus long term balance. So I think near term, Roger referenced this, but think about over the next week or so, Washington needs to come to some sort of reconciliation to raise the limit on how much debt the U.S. Treasury can take out. And there's this concept of the X date, which is basically if you assume there's June 1st, the debt ceiling doesn't get raised, and then you have weeks or days or months where there's no extension and we can't raise any more money, well, the ability for those bonds to actually pay out is limited. So what tends to happen is those bonds that are potentially impacted over that period will trade with wider yields. They'll sell off in price. And so the way we're generally taking advantage of that is we'd like to have the money, but there are certain buyers of these who probably need the money on those specific dates. So the near-term impact is going to be some buyers that avoid those specifically impacted holdings. And we've seen this story before. We've used the analogy of it's like a kidney stone. You know it's coming, it'll pass, but it hurts. And we're at the painful part right now. We do think there will be a reconciliation, but I think we largely agree with that view that the real challenge is over the next 3 months, right? Once we get past this, I could envision a scenario where there's the summer doldrums, but we hit Labor Day and rates are still at 5%. There's more debt, inflation's still high. And so we get back to this notion of, whereas the last 5-10 years, you've been in this low rate environment supported by financial authorities, monetary authorities, you're going to have the other side of this, which is the next few years, elevated rates, a higher debt load, higher inflation, continued volatility. So our view is, yes, recession in the back half of the year, likely relatively mild, but we're going to be dealing with this hangover, so to speak, of elevated debt levels, elevated yield levels, in some cases, some irresponsible borrowing by companies and other entities that we're going to be working through over the next couple of years. So if you think back to 2020, you had this scenario where the market sold off, there was tremendous uncertainty around COVID, the Fed stepped in my world, bought high yield bonds and bought investment grade bonds, or at least promised to do so, supporting the markets. Here it's the opposite, where you're getting the carpet pulled out in front of you a little bit, or from under you a little bit. And so we're going to be dealing with extended volatility for probably years, depending on the market.
Thanks. I think Pat's got the mic. Go ahead.
I do have the mic, scary as that is. Mine's a big picture question. I always think about this. When I graduated from college, and since 1983 to the present, we've been in this environment where interest rates have steadily just gone down and down and down. And that's created an environment where many people could leverage up. Interest rate and debt costs pretty much remain stable. Now we're at the end of that cycle. And during that cycle, we saw equities stop paying dividends, start being more focused on growth and capital appreciation. Do you guys think, and then one other part to that, the speed of technology and artificial intelligence. Do you guys think that we're going back to an environment where stocks, you're going to see more and more stocks pay dividends? Yields on stocks are going back to, there was a point where the dividend yield on stocks was higher than the yield on bonds back pre-80. Are we going back to a world where you're going to start to see stocks paying dividends because cash flow is going to matter more than price appreciation? And then the other part, I'm always interested in, the Silicon Valley Bank situation was a great example of it. The speed with which information went from a rumor to people reaching for their app and requesting transfer of deposits from Silicon Valley Bank to another bank that created a financial crunch. What are we doing about that? Are we going to see investments become less liquid? You're smiling, so maybe I'm making some sense. Are investments going to become less liquid so that gut reaction by consumers can be tamed down a little bit? Where do you think we're going? The relationship between stocks, bonds, and the speed of information.
So I'll offer maybe a couple comments, but a lot to unpack in that one, and happy to do so over a glass of wine as well. So let me start with the end question there, and we can work backwards. Fully agree on the banking specific side. So when we think about our underwriting of banks, there was a presumption that we wouldn't see that rush of liquidity that we saw in the case of Silicon Valley Bank. And to put it in perspective, you saw 40+ billion outflows in a single day. Yep. Whereas if you go back to even 2008, you look at Washington Mutual, that took weeks. Mm-hmm. So our view is the regional banking model will be put under pretty pronounced pressure. I think it's going to be harder for those banks to raise capital. It's really repriced the regional banking side. The beneficiary of this is probably larger banks, where you don't have that same potential for the significant, highly correlated inflows and outflows, given that the regional banking model tended to be industry specific or at least concentrated. I would caveat that by saying that the US model is very different. Like if you look at Europe, you look at Canada, they have more of a national champion type model. So there's likely to be some reversion back there. I would say the other big trend from our perspective, and this coincides with the question around high yield, historically in a world where stock dividends are high, bond yields are high, rates are declining, depending on the environment you're in, there might not be a huge liquidity premium in the market. I do think that's going to be the big change, and that's where you've seen capital flow. That's where you've seen product innovation, is around that liquidity mismatch. So you saw it in the case of banks. I think more and more what you'll see, similar to Roger's comments, I don't think investors have given as much consideration to the weighted average life. It's typically been, well, here's the yield on the bond and here's what I think stocks are going to do. I think you're going to see a more nuanced approach, both in terms of how you think about that weighted average life of the investment type or access to capital versus the instrument. And then secondarily, banks are a great example of having an asset liability mismatch. You're also going to see more of a focus on that in terms of the product innovation and how you access a lot of these investments, because this liquidity risk was less known and the liquidity premium was relatively compressed. So hopefully that answers at least part of the question, but those are our high level thoughts. I don't know if others want to opine as well.
So my latest research is actually about that last question of yours about banks. And so I have a new article about this exact question. And it's comparing online banks, so like CIT Bank and E-Trade Bank, to traditional brick and mortar banks. And what I've shown is that, the traditional business model for banks are more profitable when interest rates rise because their loans pay more, but they don't pay their customers that much more money because the customers are just hold their money there and don't demand higher returns. But what I'm showing is that it's totally different for online banks. Online banks, CD rates and money market rates actually match the Fed funds rate very closely because their customers are much flightier. It's much easier to take money out, and so they're forced to match those rates. And what that's meant in recent quarters is that the rates at online banks are now much, much better than at traditional banks, and they've seen huge deposit inflows. So people are taking their money out of traditional banks, out of brick and mortar banks, moving their money to online banks. And so if any of you are looking for a place to put your CDs, look at online banks. They pay something a lot closer to 5%. Your JP Morgan or whatever will pay much less than that.
Another comment from the panel, or?
Yeah, maybe just one other comment, one other question too after this, and then we'll wrap it up.
We'll break, yeah.
Okay, good. We're getting close here. I was just going to add too. We're kind of in this off cycle period as well. We had like $5 trillion of cash infused into the marketplace because we were coming off of COVID and things like that. And then Roger alluded to the fact that sort of interest rates sort of snuck up on us last year and then just popped up. You guys saw the graph. So it's a little bit of an unusual cycle occurred. And while it feels like we're sort of topping out, I don't want to make too many predictions here. Things really did kind of creep up on people in an unusual way. So I think the normal models for predicting where things were going to go have got kind of spun out of control a little bit. And then you asked an interesting question about AI and kind of where all that's going. And I think it's pretty early to know, but there are some predictions that say we're going to be 20 or 30% more efficient as knowledge workers. This whole industry is filled with knowledge workers. Or maybe we need 20 to 30% fewer people too, potentially. It's a little early for us to know that, but we'll have to come back and check in on that one. But as you've heard, a lot of interesting future conversations here. I think around currencies, around banking, potentially around real estate as well. So we're going to keep this forum going, and we really thank you very, very much for attending today. And I'm so grateful to be up here with our panelists today. It's been a real pleasure. We're going to continue with a little drinks and food, right?
Yeah. Thank you all so much. Please thank our panelists one more time. Thanks for your patience too as we went a little over. But I want to thank you all too. Just a fantastic discussion. And Peter, thanks for getting a question out to everyone at the end. There is food out there on the veranda. There is drink somewhere in the room. Please enjoy. Please come up and meet our panelists. And I look forward to some informal conversation. Thanks again.